I would like to give you this presentation on the Holy Shroud of Turin, a fantastic relic which Divine Providence has given to our days to remind us of the reality of the passion, death, and resurrection of our Lord. The conference will have 3 parts after a little introduction. The introduction will present to you what the Holy Shroud is, the cloth, some of the marks on the shroud, and some of the adventures that the shroud has been involved with. Then we'll look at the scientific part, especially through the work of the STURP, the American team that studied the shroud back in 1978. Actually, they started about 72, 73, and some of the members are still alive. We'll look at this. We'll talk about the carbon-14 issue, the various things science has concluded looking at the shroud. Part 2 will be the history and the art. The shroud is this piece of cloth which we believe, and that's the purpose of this talk, is the burial cloth of our Lord Jesus Christ. And therefore this relic has been preserved, has been shown, has been venerated over the last 2,000 years since the death of our Lord, since his resurrection. And it's important to realize that all the fields must coordinate. Like if science says the shroud dates from the 1200, history must agree with that. Because if history says, hold on a second, we have proof of the existence of the shroud in the year 1000, then there's a problem. And that's why we need to look at history and art as well, because history can be recorded in many ways, in books, but also in paintings. And it is also very interesting, you will see. And part 3 will be the medical findings, the shroud seen by the doctors. There's a famous book by the French surgeon, Dr. Pierre Barbet, A Doctor at Calvary. In French, they call it La Passion selon le chirurgien, so the passion of our Lord according to the surgeon. It's very interesting, and that's another field of information that we find in the shroud, which we have to take in consideration. Whatever theory comes up with the formation of the image, we have to overlap all these information. And that is why the shroud is something really fabulous. The shroud is called the Shroud of Turin, because at present it is kept in the Cathedral of Turin, dedicated to St. John the Baptist. But it has not always been there. You will see this is the end of a long journey. We started in Jerusalem. It arrived in Turin in 1578. Cardinal Charles Borromeo, St. Charles Borromeo, had made a vow just, I don't know if it's 1577 or 78, early in the year, that if Milan was protected from an epidemic, I think it was the cholera, you say cholera, the pest, that he would walk from Milan to Chambéry, across the French Alps, to venerate the shroud. That was his vow. I'm going to walk, 500 miles to go and venerate this relic. And Milan was protected, and so the cardinal started his 500 miles-ish journey. But when the people of Chambéry heard that the cardinal was walking, they said, wait, we'll do our part as well. And they walked from Chambéry to Turin, which was the central point, the meeting point. And the shroud stayed there ever since. These are pictures of the exposition of 1978, which was done on the occasion of the fourth centenary of the arrival of the shroud in Turin, 1578, 1978. 3.5 million people came to see the shroud over a period of about 40 days, 30, 40 days. And I was fortunate then to be part of this crowd because it was on October 2nd, October 2, 1978. I was in Geneva. I just arrived as I was about to enter the seminary on October 7th. And the priest of Geneva said, let's go and venerate the shroud, which we did. The shroud has been kept for about 300 years in this reliquary over a special altar that was built in a special chapel behind the main altar of the cathedral. You can see over the altar, you can see this big box with the bars protecting the shroud. So at that time, the shroud was rolled over a cylinder and kept in this wooden box decorated with silver. As we go along, you will see that the shroud was kept in many, many different ways, folded in different ways, kept in different ways, according to circumstances. So the shroud, here's the shroud, according to this artist, Italian artist, Giovanni Battista della Rovere. Notice, so it's the cloth in which Jesus was laid on the backside, and then it was flipped over, and it reached back to the feet, and then it was tied with little strings. So the shroud was not flat over him; it really took the shape of his body, roughly, so to speak. When the artist painted the shroud or carved the shroud in the different sculptures that we have, or on medals, we have also medals of the shroud, artists usually make mistakes because the original shroud is very yellow, or I would say very, it's not brown, it's yellowish, and it's very hard to see. And so artists kind of complete the details that their eyes don't see. They just say, well, it must be like this. For example, here, some of the errors here, you can see that the wrapping in the shroud in this painting is at the foot of the cross. Well, it was not there. It was in the sepulcher. You can see on our Lord has his feet straight or pointing to one towards another, but on the shroud above, the feet are pointing outwards, which is an error of the painter. You can see our Lord has a loincloth here by modesty as we represent him, whilst on the shroud he has nothing. And another very interesting detail is that in the painting here, we can see the thumbs. His hands have 5 fingers, whilst on the shroud we only see 4. So it's interesting to notice some of these details, which are details of authenticity, when we see the reproduction, when the artists actually see the original shroud. So here we have it. It's approximately 14 feet and a half long and 3.5 feet wide. Interesting detail, which some Jewish people or biblical experts as well have pointed out. The dimension of the shroud are very simple according to the Jewish measure. Kude, so I don't know the word in English. Kude, which is an arm length that they used to measure. It's 8 by 2. We'll need to look at the English words for that one. But so 8 by 2, 2 feet wide, 2 kude or arm length wide, and 8 long in length. So here we have just the facial view. We see the top of the head, we see the side wound, blood stain, the wrist wound, blood stain. We have watermarks, so we'll speak about that in a moment. And we see the bottom of the feet. That's the facial view. In the facial view, the feet are cut. We don't see the toes of the feet. Whilst when we see the dorsal view, we see the full foot. I've heard different theories about this. One is that somebody would have cut the shroud. The other, I think, which probably more simple, is that when they laid our Lord flat in the sepulchre, so they put the cloth, but when they flipped the upper layer, they had slightly miscalculated because of the body's position, and it did not reach the toes, which is a very simple explanation. Here's the dorsal view. See the top of the head, we see marks of the crown of thorns. The blood flow at the small of the back. We see on the legs a lot of scourge marks, and the bottom of the feet, which we see quite complete. And we see a little bit of extra shroud length beyond the feet, as you can see over here, just at the bottom of the feet there. So, not every, but quite a number of science has looked at the shroud. One element that was observed, was studied, is what is this cloth? What is it made of? How is it done? How is it done? So it's made of linen, and you can see here different types of weaving the linen. They've analyzed even every thread, as you can see here. And so you can see this actually up on the image in the middle up here is actually the threads of the cloth. You can see tiny little threads, so threads twisted. And so it's a 3-to-1 herringbone twill. So each thread passing underneath 3 threads and then over 1. And that's what makes the diagonal lines, as you can see clearly here. That's a close-up view of the shroud. In herringbone pattern, you see the lines going up and down and up and down. It's because of this herringbone, the 3 going on underneath 3 and over 1 pattern. So it's a piece of linen cloth of the 1st century. Here we see different marks on the shroud, which is what people see usually first. As we have said, the shroud has gone through a lot of history. We find all the marks in blue. You can see the blue lines correspond to water marks at one time when the shroud was folded. And we actually don't know when this happened. We see these white patches. They have these 2 lines on both sides of the body, which are the result of a fire, as you can see in the heading, fire 1532 in Chambéry. The cloth then was folded in like this, folded in about a square foot, so 48 layers. And as you can see, the box below here, A, B, C, D being the 4 corners of the shroud. It was in a reliquary, so in a metal box. It was inserted in the wall of the church, and obviously with a grid and a lock. The church went on fire, and people start screaming, the shroud, let's us save the shroud. And as it often happened, they can't find the key of the lock because they're panicking or the right person is not there. Anyway, by the time they actually got the reliquary out, it had started to be damaged by the fire. And so the black part here, all this was literally damaged. It was a hole, burnt by the fire. And when they opened it, then you have the full result of the marks of the fire on the whole length of the shroud. But this fire of 1532 shows how much divine providence watches over this relic, because imagine doing an artist doing a painting of our Lord back and front, the full length, fold it in 48 layers, and then take a pair of scissors and cut without touching the face, without touching the wound of the heart, without touching any essential parts, you'd probably have to try many times. And so this would happen if I go back that one slide. You can see that the marks of the fire actually have frame the face. We will see these marks as we go along, but we'll see clear, much closer later on. So the shroud was rolled under over the cylinder for about 300 years, as we have said, from probably the 1600s, until the late 1900s. In 1997, they wanted to repair some wiring in the chapel, some of the electrical wiring, and so they moved the shroud out. They created this glass wall with a glass container in which they put the shroud. It was bulletproof. The glass was about 5 centimeters thick, fireproof, bulletproof. But since the fire was damaging the ceiling, parts of the ceiling were falling down, the firemen came and broke the glass and saved the Holy Shroud from greater damage, perhaps irreversible damage. We don't know if this fire was criminal fire or accidental, but the shroud survived. I would like to show you now a little clip of the firemen saving the shroud.
It's the night of the 11th and 12th of April 1997. The restoration work, 25 meters high, rises. The firemen arrive. It is a dramatic situation. One of the most prestigious Baroque works of art is being destroyed by fire. The first thing the firemen do when they arrive is to save the shroud, which is in great danger. It is extremely hot. The fire is very near and burning fragments are dropping onto the choir where the relic is kept. The casket won't open, and so they try to smash it. At 1:30 in the morning, the shroud is safe. As bodyguards, the firemen carry it out of the cathedral and right to the house of the Cardinal of Turin, Giovanni Saldarini. A year later, April the 15th, 1998, after a forced exile in a secret place, the shroud returns to the dome. In the presence of Cardinal Saldarini, the shroud was unfolded. A group of experts try to straighten out the numerous foldings. The operation lasts for hours. Measures for the new conservation was taken already in 1992 when major experts of the shroud were convened in Turin. After 4 years, the study commission decided that the precious cloth must no longer be rolled over a cylinder. This decision was taken in order to prevent mechanical damages, formation of folds, chemicals responsible for the progressive yellowing of the tissues. This yellowing, caused by contact with the atmosphere, could with time, the precious cloth was transferred to the new casket. It is an armored structure made of stainless steel and bulletproof glass. Its length is 4 meters and 64 centimeters. Its width is 1 meter and 38 centimeters. Its depth is 28 centimeters. The thickness of the protecting glass is 5 centimeters. Shroud experts have thus singled out the right measures in order to meet the various requirements of security. From inside, the casket is airtight. Now the shroud lies in an environment full of circulating argon gas, a neutral gas.
Here was a report of that fire. As you can see, this is actually a Hong Kong newspaper. You can see the chapel at the back being really on fire. And the shroud being in a wooden box, it wrapped in this red plastic bag, was saved by divine providence. Here you can see them looking at the shroud after the fire. The shroud was not damaged. Thanks be to God. So, this gives you an idea of the shroud. Now let's go deeper in the scientific part. We will start with this STIR project of 1978. and move actually forward, backward. The scientific era of the shroud started in 1898 with the discovery, the photographic discoveries of the shroud. We'll talk about this in a moment, but we will speak of the various scientific aspects of the shroud. So first of all, here's the two leaders of the STURP team, Dr. John Jackson and Eric Jumper, physicists of the U.S. Air Force working at the NASA. And I hope to meet in June Dr. Jackson, who is still alive. He's in Colorado Spring. And you can see them actually looking at an image of the shroud in front of them. We'll talk about this three-dimension aspect of the shroud. So they're the one who got very puzzled back in 1972, 73, puzzled by this image. They had seen pictures, they had not seen the original, and they use their computers to look at this image, and they said, this is very, very strange. And they had this scientific curiosity to organize a whole team of scientists that would go and organize a scientific analysis of the shroud. They got the permissions, and here they come with about 80 crates of scientific equipment. There's a whole story about shipping that equipment. The equipment arrived in Milan and was blocked at the border, at the immigration, because on one of the boxes it was written X-rays, X-ray machine. They were going to take X-ray of the shroud, and the customs did not want to let go of this dangerous equipment. They had to go and talk, I think, to one of the ministers of state, and they were about to make a big scandal if they did not let it out. Anyway, 2 days before the scientific marathon started, they had 120 hours to study the shroud. Well, 2 days before, you can see the crates arrived. They had found a garbage truck to bring the crates because they had nothing. They had found nothing else. And they get organized. They had made this big table to hold the shroud. You can see Dr. Jackson in the middle, preparing everybody to this analysis of the shroud. It's very interesting when you read the books and the story of this adventure, how careful they were. They're scientists. They work on atoms and they work on particles, and how careful they were that nothing they would do would damage the shroud. And so they had a very special table made. They would even cover it, we'll see it shortly, with special foil they use on satellites. These men work for the NASA, so they have access to equipment that they use in the space. And they also had, you can see on top of the table there, these little white marks. These are magnets, you can see below here as well. Magnets that they had covered with Teflon so that they would not leave a mark or leave any particles of iron or anything on the shroud. They had quite a surprise when the shroud was brought in. I think around midnight, the shroud was brought in this. When the sisters removed the plastic, the cover of it, they saw that the scientists saw that the shroud was actually pinned on a wooden frame with rusty thumbtacks, just ordinary thumbtacks. You can see at the back of the sister, you can see the foil that is covering the table, and you can see the magnets as well. They're a bit better. I mean, this is foil used for satellites. It's interesting that they have this. And so then the study began. They're mostly American. They had a few Italians, some French, and there's a Swiss detective. Since the fire of 1532, they had put the sisters who had repaired the shroud in 1534 had put a cloth at the back of the shroud. They call it the Holland cloth, a green cloth, And for this occasion, they removed it. So they were able to answer some of the major questions they had. For instance, did the image penetrate the cloth? Can you see it on the other side of the cloth? You can see here Dr. Jackson there, and Dr. Jumper, you can see his name, Jumper there, and the Italian here on the right there. So they're analyzing the shroud, and they want to find out if what made that image. We'll see here some of the equipment they have used, but since I have this picture right here, so they had cameras, they had macro cameras, whatever, and they do photo microscopy. There was one moment when one of the cameramen was taking a shot of the nose of the Holy Face. And as he was holding his camera and his flash, something was reflecting light in the cloth. But he had his camera to the maximum zoom, so he called his colleague with a microscope. He said, "Can you put your microscope right here and tell me what you see inside the cloth?" So he hung the microscope, and the answer was, a moment later, he says, "Oh, you know what it is? Grains of sand." On the tip of the nose, there were grains of sand, which confirmed the fact that our Lord fell face down when he carried his cross. And they checked other parts of the body. They found some grains of sand on the knees and under the sole of the feet. On the sole of the feet. Imagine a forger in the 1300 thinking of that detail, making this image of the shroud by whatever means, but thinking of putting some grains of sand at key places. I mean, it's just impossible. So different other equipment they had. You can see him taking a photo of a close-up, really, the right bit over here. They took pictures of almost every square inch of the shroud. They took x-rays of the shroud by removing some panels of the table. And one of the big questions they had was, how is the image made? First of all, there's two types of image on the body. We have in the upper image here, on the upper photo, you have what is called the body image areas, and in the lower part you have the blood stain areas. And you can see in this one of the most important pictures, you can see that the fibers, the little threads which are smaller than a hair, are slightly yellowed. I mean, the real color is kind of yellow. And only on one side of your hair, it's slightly discolored. Imagine the precision of the coloring. And these threads this discoloration is only on the surface. If I could scratch the thread here with the mouse, there'll be nothing underneath. And below you have, and in the body image did not penetrate the cloth. It stayed on the top layer of the top fibers, whilst the bloodstained area did penetrate, and they found it on the other side. On the shroud, we see a lot of things. We see here, you can see the stitches of the nuns who fixed the fire in 1534. Patches, and you can see the different weaving as well. Here's the marks of a fire which dates or predates 1195. We will prove that in a moment with when we come to the art, the history and the art section. You can see some parts with the burnt area. This here is a stain of wax. People venerated the shroud. You can see on the next slide here, people coming to venerate the shroud, because the shroud was the possession of private individual for centuries. It only became possession of the church in the 1980s. So here we see the priest actually fixing. If you see closely, we can see there's a thread in his hand. You can see a needle in his hand and a thread going down. And you can see the people here coming to venerate the shroud holding large, long candles. It's a relic. People want to kiss it. They're holding candles. They bend and candle drips on the shroud, as it has been proven. So, what made the image? The answer is we don't know. That's what the answer is, because no pigment of any kind was found on the cloth, neither mineral, animal, chemical, oil, whatever. Nothing was put on the shroud to make the color. Something made the body image, but we don't know what. That's what the scientists say. Not only that, but if an artist had painted the shroud, his hand would have moved from right to left, from left to right, top to bottom, made lines. Well, they did not find any direction in the image. Everything happens in a flash. The whole body, the whole 14 foot of the image. You see, as we're going along, we're adding elements of the shroud. One of these elements is the water stain. You can see a big one here on his belly. The water stain did not affect the threads. So they looked at the threads outside the water stain and inside the water stain. It was the same. And also the fire mark, the fire of 1532. They checked the threads next to the fire. The image is the same. Having removed the Holland cloth, the green cloth behind the shroud, they were able to take a picture from behind. So here you can see they put a spotlight behind the shroud, and with this backlighting, only the blood stain, and we see a bit of the watermarks, but the blood stain here's the hand, the arms, the wound of the heart, but the body disappeared, which means that, where there is blood, the blood blocks the light. Where there is no blood, well, the light just goes through and takes away the image, because there's only threads. There's no the cloth. There's nothing blocking the light. Here's we'll talk about this in a minute when we come to the photographic negative. Okay. Another discovery using ultraviolet fluorescence photograph is, here you can see the spear wound blood stain, the side wound. Here's the picture, and here's when I take the ultraviolet. You can see on the side of the blood there, you can see this lighter liquid, which is the serum halo, which is only visible through ultraviolet fluorescence. So which means it is really human blood. It has the real serum of the human blood. Professor Adler, who was part of the team, of the Disturb team, is the one who proved that on the shroud, the blood stain marks are truly human blood of the group AB, the universal receiver. And one question that a number of people had is, why do the blood stains on the shroud remain reddish? Why don't they turn black or dark? If you cut yourself and you bleed, you put a bandage and there's blood on it and you remove it, leave it on your desk. After a few hours, a few days, it will turn black. Here, they were talking about 2,000 years, it has not turned black. And Professor Adler has proven that it is caused by the excess of an element of the blood, which is the bilirubin. And the blood produces bilirubin in excess when the person is tortured. So there's a bodily reaction. And not only it was produced in excess, but then he died right after. Because obviously, if he gets better, then the blood will get its normal composition, okay, in proper quantities. You can see here at the bottom the blood stain of the forehead, the number 3 or letter E, which is there on the forehead. We'll look at this when we talk about the crowning of thorns. So one of the men who was there in October 78 was this professor, a Swiss detective, Dr. Max Frey, a pollinologist, a specialist in pollens. You can see here taking samples of the shroud, and you can see some of his slides of the where he took the pollens out of the shroud. So just by going outside, especially now in the spring, there's lots of pollen in the air, invisible to the eye, but it sticks to our clothes. And so pollen is that little ball right here between the threads of the shroud. And so Dr. Frey managed to identify over 100 types of pollens, which he grouped in 3. So they have pollens coming from the Jerusalem Holy Land area, pollens from Turkey, and pollens from Europe. And through this, we can follow, literally the trace of the shroud. See, like he says here, there's 38 plants from the area of Jerusalem, the area, 18 plants from Turkey, southern Turkey, because it was in Edessa. It was for a while. We'll see that later on. 14 plants from the area of Constantinople, and then another 29 plants in Europe, Italy, and central France. I mentioned to you that the 2 Americans, Drs. Jackson and Jumper, were interested in the shroud back in the early 70s, particularly with this VPA computer image analyzer. It's used to study the effects of atomic bombs. There's an error that's a common error, which is a spread, which says that the VP8 was used to study the relief of planets, and the answer is no. It's used for the effect of atomic bombs, the explosion. And so they put an image of the Holy Face, as you can see there on the right, and that is what really poked their scientific curiosity. If you put an ordinary image, like these 2 children, in the VP8, you have these distorted results. They have buttons. They can also play with the 3D, but it does not come out very nicely with these, because the image, the light comes from outside on the face of the children. But when you put the Holy Shroud in the VP8, the reaction is different. And there's something written, there's some information written on the shroud, which the scientists guessed, which again, we will see at the end when we'll hear Dr. Jackson giving the theory. His conclusion is that there's an element of verticality, of distance between the cloth and the body, written in the cloth. So where it is darker, then the body was closer to the shroud. Where it is lighter, the body was a bit further. And so they can read the density of the body image, and that gives a 3-dimension. There's only a little sketch here. It was ultimately determined that the image on the shroud was darkest at the points where the body and cloth came into direct contact. For example, the tip of the nose, the top of the hands, and grew more faint as the distance between them increased, up to the maximum imaging distance of about 4 centimeters. But you have to remember as we're looking at this here, this is a little sketch, we have it here as well, that actually the cloth wrapped the body. It was not flat over the body. This correlation of subject distance to image density is never found in normal photographs or painted works of art. It could only have occurred if the cloth was laying over the body at the time the image was formed. But as I say, it was wrapping the body. We'll see what Dr. Jackson says later on. It also explains why the VP8 image analyzer creates such an accurate and natural relief of a human form from any shroud photograph. Yet because of its complexity, this property still remains the most misunderstood characteristic of the shroud image. We can only give hypotheses. Here you can see from the head to the knees. This was the old VP8. Now they have VP8 means 8 shades of gray, but now they have more sophisticated machines which can really reproduce the whole body of our Lord. Now let's come to the carbon-14. In simple language, everything that breathes absorbs carbon-14, which is in the air. Now, when that breathing creature dies, whether it's here you have the tree or the cow, the vegetable plants, the cow or ourselves, human, when we die, so we stop absorbing carbon-14, but because we go into the earth and we start decomposing, the carbon-14 loses some atoms and turns into carbon-12. And by counting in a sophisticated way, that's how they can evaluate the age of the thing that they're measuring. So there's the disintegration of 5,730 years it takes for the carbon-14 to turn into carbon-12. So the studies were done in 1987, 1988 by 3 different labs, one in Switzerland, in Zurich, one in England, in Oxford, and one in the US, in Tucson. And on October 13th, 1988, in England, in London, they gave a press conference giving the conclusions of the studies of the 3 labs, which is summarized here in, I would say, the most striking detail is the exclamation mark next to 1390. So they say the shroud was the cloth, because they were analyzing the age of the cloth, so the age of these plants. They said it was between 1260 and 1390, so a mean age of, say, 1320. And so as if to say, okay, you Catholics, you may have great devotion for this cloth, but it's only an icon. It's not a relic. It's not an original. How can it be the image of Christ and the blood of Christ if it was only made in 1300? So you're a bit 1300 years off. We're sorry about this, but science has spoken. And you need to bow down to the conclusion of science. They took their samples over here in the top left corner of the shroud. You can see here in blown up. Actually, the sample they took was this one here, this little strip that they cut, and they cut it into 2, and each lab got one of these samples the size of a stamp, roughly. Now, a little observation. So they took the sample on the edge of the facial part of the shroud, the facial view, so on the right side. Now, but that place, you can see him cutting the cloth here, okay? That place was one of the parts of the shroud that people were holding. whenever they had public exhibitions, as you see here, this is from 1613, you can see the bishop holding the cloth. The one in the corner here, he's holding the cloth right there. Here's another one, even clearer. So the person is holding the cloth at the very spot where it was cut for carbon dating, which already says, well, there was a lot of handling, people sweating, people with maybe hands not so clean. They were not using gloves. And here they are, holding the shroud at that very spot. Different theories have been put forward to explain why the carbon-14 dating concluded to 1300. The conclusive one, which is rather recent, it was put forward in about the year 2000 by a couple, and it was scientifically tested and proven that there's some inconsistencies in the samples that they took, inconsistencies in the weaving, in the threads of the cloth. So they've done a lot of analysis. Was Ray Rogers, who was a member of the Disturb team, one of their all scientists. Some are more photographers, but he was one of the physicists, and he analyzed this theory, and he said the theory is correct. So they had spliced dyed threads. So they found that in the samples that they analyzed, that the labs analyzed, had been repaired in the 1500s and repaired in such a professional way that there was no knots between the threads. The threads are, we say, they are spliced, so they're joined together. The sailors do that when they have to with their ropes on the ship, or the scouts do that as well. But they use cotton threads spliced to linen threads. So two different plants. And they dyed each thread one by one as they were doing it, which is impossible to see at the human eye. That's why it's so perfect. But Ray Rogers analyzed it, and he says that's it. That's the conclusion. He said this would appear to be obvious evidence of a medieval artisan's attempt to dye a newly added repair region of fabric to match the aged appearance of the remainder of the shroud. And so to have a piece of 1500, a thread of 1500, and a thread of a cloth of the first century caused that wrong conclusion in the carbon dating. We go back to 1898, which was when the first photographs of the shroud were taken in Turin. You can recognize here the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, actually, with the old altar. You can see the people at the bottom there in veneration of the shroud. So it was at this occasion that the photographer of the House of Savoy, Secondo Pia, got permission to take pictures. Photography was rather recent, it started in 1812. We are now 1898. This is his big camera. One of our boys from Singapore, before I left Singapore, he went to Glasgow, to Scotland, to do, I think, a master's degree in photography. And he was able to see these kind of cameras. And I don't know, I think to use it. They had this big negative plate, as you see here. They're about 1 square feet that you put into the camera. And so the one on the top left is the shroud exposed 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and 5 minutes. And so when Secondo Pia took the plates and went to the dark room to develop the plates, he got the shock of his life by realizing that the first step of developing a photo had already been done. In other words, the shroud was reacting exactly like a negative. And so the result was already a positive. He didn't have to go through the whole process. You can see here the image on the left. This is what we call a positive. So the man there is normal. You see the shroud as we see it. But it's kind of, the colors are like backwards. And when you go to the right, you can see that the man's colors are backward, but the shroud colors are actually normal. That's the positive. But just to make it more complicated, notice the wound, the blood stain of the hands and of the side. Here they are dark, like the man's hair, but over here they are white, which means that the shroud, the body image parts are like a negative, but the blood-stained part are in positive. So you have both at the same time. So another puzzle for the science of photography. You can see quite clearly, you can see that the blood is clearly here negative when it turns white. Whilst the face, here the face is much easier to read the face, the whole body actually, because the whole body image there is a negative. So with these pictures you can see what we're talking about, the three-dimension aspect of the shroud. So you can see what is darker is closer to the cloth. What is brighter, like around the eyes and on the ears on the side of the face, which we don't see, it's whiter, it's more faint. And this is also a little bit enhanced, the picture on the left, I think to help us understand the image, because the real colors are even far more yellow. It's very, very hard to see. So the conclusion of the science, different aspect that they discovered by studying the shroud, are that the image is superficial, there's no direction, there's nothing added to the cloth, it resists water, it resists fire, the fire of 1532. There's also a chemical stability of the threads. It has photographic negative properties. It has a three-dimension property, and it's very, very precise. And so here are their major conclusions. The blood stains contain residues of primate blood, so it's real blood, real human blood. Direct testing of the shroud cloth revealed no anomalies for the image area. In other words, nothing was added or nothing strange, nothing beside the threads. Physical and chemical tests of image fibers reveal that image is not a painting, a rubbing, or a scorch. The image consists of oxidation or dehydration of the uttermost surface of the outer fibers of each thread. So we're talking about, thinner than a human hair. Bloodstains penetrate the cloth, body image does not. And they've also analyzed the threads where there was a blood stain, and they came to the conclusion that the blood stains went on the cloth first, because the threads of the blood stain contain no body image. In simple language, the blood came on Good Friday, and the body image came on Easter Sunday. And when there was the flash of the resurrection, the blood, where there was blood, it stopped the threads from turning yellow. And the image has a 3D characteristics, unlike ordinary paintings or photographs. So the conclusion of the team, the answer to the question of how the image was produced or what produced the image remains now in 1981, as it has in the past, a mystery. And in 2018, it still is. We can conclude for now that the shroud image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. And by the way, there's only one man crucified in the history that was wearing a crown of thorns. which is also on the cloth. It is not the product of an artist. That's proven. The blood stains are composed of hemoglobin and also give a positive test for serum albumin. The image is an ongoing mystery, and until further chemical studies are made, perhaps by this group of scientists or by some others, in the future the problem remains unsolved. End of part 1.